In the summer of 1939, as Europe descended into war and America watched from across the ocean, a small group of engineers gathered in a Burbank, California hangar to begin work on an aircraft that would change the way the world traveled. They didn't know it then, but they were designing more than just an airliner. They were creating a symbol of elegance, of progress, and of an era when flying was not merely transportation, but an experience to be savored. This is the story of the Lockheed Constellation, the aircraft that defined the golden age of flight. The year was 1939, and commercial aviation was still in its adolescence. Airlines operated a hodgepodge of aircraft, Douglas DC-3S, Boeing 307 Stratoliners, and various smaller types, each with limitations that constrained the industry's growth. Transcontinental flights required multiple fuel stops. Passengers endured hours of discomfort in unpressurized cabins, buffeted by turbulence at low altitudes. International travel was the domain of flying boats, enormous seaplanes that landed on water, which were slow, expensive, and weather-dependent. The industry needed something better, something revolutionary. That something would come from an unlikely partnership between two visionaries, Howard Hughes and the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. Howard Hughes was already a legend by 1939. The son of a wealthy Texas oil man, Hughes had become one of Hollywood's most successful producers, creating films like Hell's Angels and Scarface. But his true passion was aviation. Hughes was a pilot himself, holder of multiple speed records, and owner of Trans World Airlines TWA. He understood both the technical aspects of aircraft design and the business realities of commercial aviation. And he had a vision. An airliner that could fly coast to coast without stopping, carry passengers in pressurized comfort, and do it faster than anything currently flying. Hughes approached Lockheed with this vision in 1939. Lockheed, based in Burbank, California, was a respected but relatively small aircraft manufacturer. They had built successful designs like the Model 10 Electra and the twin-engine Model 14 Super Electra, which airlines appreciated for their reliability and performance. But they had never attempted anything as ambitious as what Hughes was proposing. The specifications Hughes laid out were extraordinary for the time. He wanted an aircraft that could carry 40 to 60 passengers at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour. It needed a pressurized cabin so it could fly above most weather, providing a smooth ride. It required a range of at least 3,000 miles, enough to cross the United States with just one stop, or to fly non-stop from New York to Paris. And it had to be beautiful. Hughes understood that aviation in the post-war era would be competitive, and aesthetics mattered. An ugly airplane, no matter how capable, wouldn't capture the public's imagination. Lockheed assigned the project to a brilliant young engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson. At just 29 years old, Johnson was already recognized as one of the brightest minds in aviation. He had designed the P-38 Lightning fighter, which would become one of America's most successful combat aircraft. Johnson approached the airliner project with the same innovative thinking he applied to fighters: minimize drag, maximize efficiency, and make every design choice serve multiple purposes. The aircraft that emerged from Johnson's team was unlike anything that had flown before. The fuselage was long and gracefully curved, shaped like a dolphin's body to minimize air resistance. The wings were slim and elegant, with a gentle sweep that gave the aircraft a sense of forward motion even when standing still. But the most distinctive feature, the one that would make the Constellation instantly recognizable, was the tail. Johnson designed a triple tail configuration: 3 vertical stabilizers instead of the conventional single tail. This decision was driven by practical considerations. A single tail tall enough to provide adequate control would have been too high to fit in standard airline hangars. The triple tail solved this problem while also providing excellent stability and control. But the effect was aesthetic as much as functional. The three tails gave the Constellation a distinctive, almost regal appearance. People who saw it for the first time often stopped and stared. The engines were Wright R3350 duplex Cyclones, massive 18-cylinder radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower. 4 of them were mounted on the wings, their polished cowlings gleaming in the sun. These engines gave the Constellation both speed and range, though they would prove temperamental in service, requiring constant maintenance and attention. Inside, the cabin was pressurized, a feature still rare in 1940. This allowed the Constellation to cruise at 20,000 feet or higher, above most weather and turbulence. Passengers would ride in comfort, breathing normally, while the aircraft sliced through the thin air at altitudes where the sky turned a deeper blue and the curvature of the Earth became faintly visible at the horizon. But before the first prototype could be completed, the world changed. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America entered World War II. Overnight, the priorities of American industry shifted. Factories that had been producing consumer goods retooled for war production. Aircraft manufacturers stopped work on commercial projects and focused on military contracts. The Constellation project was frozen, its future uncertain. Then the military took notice. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed long-range transport aircraft, something fast enough to ferry personnel and high-priority cargo across oceans, with the range to minimize fuel stops and the performance to operate at high altitudes where enemy interceptors couldn't reach them. The Constellation, still under development, fit these requirements perfectly. Lockheed received a contract to produce the Constellation for military use, designated the C-69. The first prototype flew on January 9, 1943, with Lockheed test pilot Eddie Allen at the controls. Howard Hughes himself insisted on being aboard for that first flight, not as a pilot, though he was qualified, but as an observer. He wanted to see his vision become reality. The flight was a success. The Constellation handled beautifully, faster and more responsive than any transport aircraft in existence. Allen reported that it flew like a fighter, not a lumbering cargo hauler. The pressurization worked flawlessly. The engines, despite their complexity, performed as designed. It was everything Hughes had hoped for, and more. Production began immediately. Lockheed's Burbank factory, working around the clock, turned out C-69s for the military. But production was slow compared to other wartime aircraft. The Constellation was complex, with thousands of parts requiring precision assembly. Each aircraft took months to build. By the time the war ended in August 1945, only 22 C-69s had been delivered to the military. Most saw limited service, ferrying VIPs and priority cargo across the Pacific and Atlantic. But peace brought opportunity. With the war over, millions of servicemen were returning home. The economy was booming. Americans had money saved from wartime wages and rationing, and they were eager to spend it. The airline industry anticipated explosive growth in passenger traffic. People who had never flown before wanted to try air travel. Those who had flown on military transports wanted something better. The stage was set for the golden age of commercial aviation. And the Lockheed Constellation was perfectly positioned to lead it. TWA, Howard Hughes's airline, took delivery of the first commercial Constellations in late 1945. Pan American World Airways, not wanting to be left behind, also ordered a fleet. Other carriers, including Eastern Airlines, Air France, and KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, soon followed. By early 1946, the Constellation was entering regular passenger service on routes across America and around the world. Flying on a Constellation in those early post-war years was an experience unlike anything most people had known. Passengers boarded at airports that were still relatively small and informal, often just a terminal building, a control tower, and a few hangars. There was no security screening, no long lines, no impersonal crowds. Air travel was exclusive, expensive, and elegant. A ticket from New York to Los Angeles on a Constellation in 1946 cost about $160, equivalent to over $2,500 today. Only the wealthy or those on urgent business could afford it. Everyone else took the train. But those who could afford it were treated to an experience that felt more like a luxury cruise than modern air travel. Passengers walked across the tarmac, no jet bridges then, and climbed stairs to board through a rear door. Inside, the cabin was spacious and beautifully appointed. The seats were wide and plush, upholstered in fine fabrics. There was ample legroom. Large oval windows lined both sides of the fuselage, offering sweeping views of the world passing below. The lighting was warm and soft, the decor stylish in the Art Deco-influenced aesthetic of the era. Flight attendants called stewardesses then, and exclusively young women wore tailored uniforms and treated passengers with gracious formality. They served multi-course meals on fine china with real silverware and linen napkins. The food was surprisingly good: steak, lobster, roast chicken, fresh vegetables, and desserts prepared in the aircraft's small galley. Drinks were complimentary cocktails, wine, champagne. Smoking was not only permitted, but expected. Ashtrays were built into the armrests, and stewardesses carried lighters to assist passengers. The experience was social. Passengers chatted with each other, moved about the cabin freely, and sometimes gathered in a small lounge area at the rear where they could stand, stretch, and converse. Children were rare on flights. Families generally couldn't afford multiple tickets, so the atmosphere was adult and sophisticated. Businessmen conducted deals over drinks. Honeymooning couples gazed out windows at the landscape unfolding below. Celebrities traveled alongside ordinary passengers, often happy to sign autographs. And then there was the sound. The Constellation's 4 Wright R3, 1,350 engines produced a deep, rhythmic drone that permeated the cabin. It wasn't unpleasant, more of a steady hum that became background noise after a while. But it was always there, a constant reminder that you were aloft, suspended miles above the earth, in a metal tube kept airborne by engines and wings and the laws of physics. The propellers were visible through the windows, their blades spinning into translucent discs. Watching them, passengers could see the power that held them in the sky. Pilots loved the Constellation. It was fast for its time, cruising at 280 to 300 miles per hour and responsive to the controls. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent, with large windows that wrapped around the flight deck. The instrument panel was laid out logically, with gauges, switches, and levers positioned for easy access. Flying the Constellation required skill and attention. There were no autopilots sophisticated enough to handle long flights unassisted, so pilots had to actively fly the aircraft for hours, but it rewarded good technique with smooth, stable flight. Captain Paul Tibbets, who had piloted the B-29 Superfortress that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, later flew Constellations for a private airline and called it the finest transport aircraft ever built. He appreciated its combination of speed, range, and handling characteristics. You could feel the quality in every control input: Tibbets said. The Connie responded precisely, predictably. It never surprised you. That's what you want in an airliner, no surprises. But the Constellation was not without its challenges. The Wright R3350 engines, though powerful, were notoriously temperamental. They ran hot, required careful management of cylinder head temperatures, and had a tendency to catch fire if mishandled. Maintenance crews spent countless hours checking magnetos, adjusting carburetors, and replacing spark plugs. Engine failures were not uncommon, though the Constellation's 4-engine redundancy meant that losing one engine was manageable. Pilots were trained to shut down a failed engine quickly, feather its propeller to reduce drag, and continue the flight on 3 engines. In the late 1940s, Lockheed introduced improved versions of the Constellation. The Model 749 featured more fuel capacity and greater range. The Model 1049 Super Constellation, introduced in 1951, was stretched to accommodate more passengers and equipped with more powerful engines. The Super Constellation also featured distinctive wingtip fuel tanks, teardrop-shaped extensions that increased range and, incidentally, made the aircraft even more visually striking. The Super Constellation became the definitive version, widely used by airlines around the world. It could carry up to 95 passengers in a high-density configuration, though most airlines configured them for 60 to 70 passengers to maintain comfort and exclusivity. The range exceeded 4,000 miles, allowing non-stop transatlantic crossings from New York to Paris or London, weather and winds permitting. For passengers on these long-haul flights, the journey was an adventure. A transatlantic crossing on a Constellation took 12 to 14 hours, depending on winds. That's a long time in the air, but the experience was designed to be pleasant. Meals were served at regular intervals. Stewardesses distributed pillows and blankets for passengers who wanted to sleep. There were books and magazines available. Some airlines even offered small amenity kits with toothbrushes, combs, and slippers. And there was the view. On daytime flights, passengers could watch the landscape change below. Cities giving way to farmland, mountains rising in the distance, rivers snaking across plains. On transatlantic flights, there were hours over open ocean, endless blue water stretching to the horizon, occasionally broken by the white wake of a ship far below. At night, the cabin lights would dim, and passengers could see the stars through the windows, brighter and more numerous than they ever appeared on the ground. But the Constellation faced competition. Douglas Aircraft Company, Lockheed's longtime rival, introduced the DC-6 in 1947. The DC-6 was comparable to the Constellation in most respects: pressurized cabin, 4 engines, similar speed and range, and had one significant advantage. The engines were more reliable. Douglas used Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines, which were less powerful than the Wright R3350s, but far less prone to problems. Airlines appreciated this reliability, and many chose the DC-6 over the Constellation for purely practical reasons. Boeing entered the market with the Stratocruiser, a double-decked airliner based on the B-29 bomber. The Stratocruiser was luxurious, with sleeping berths and a lower-deck cocktail lounge, but it was slow and expensive to operate. It found a niche with carriers like Pan American and BOAC on long-haul routes, but never achieved the commercial success of the Constellation or DC-6. The competition between Lockheed and Douglas was fierce, sometimes bitter. Airlines played the two manufacturers against each other, negotiating for better prices and improved features. Howard Hughes, through TWA, remained loyal to the Constellation, but other carriers hedged their bets, operating mixed fleets of both aircraft types. The rivalry drove innovation. Each new variant of the Constellation, or DC-6, featured improvements, more powerful engines, greater range, better passenger amenities. The passengers were the beneficiaries. Throughout the 1950s, the Constellation reigned as one of the great airliners of the age. It flew routes that would become legendary. TWA's transcontinental Super G service from Los Angeles to New York, stopping in Chicago. Air France's transatlantic flights from Paris to New York. Qantas's Kangaroo route from Australia to London, with stops in Asia and the Middle East. These flights represented the pinnacle of air travel, expensive, exclusive, and unforgettable. The Constellation became a cultural icon. It appeared in advertisements, movies, and magazines. Norman Rockwell painted a cover for the Saturday Evening Post showing passengers boarding a Constellation, capturing the glamour and optimism of the era. Hollywood celebrities were frequently photographed at airports, boarding or deplaning from Constellations. Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe, Elizabeth Taylor all flew on Connies, and the press loved photographing them on the tarmac beside the elegant aircraft. For Americans in the 1950s, the Constellation symbolized modernity and progress. It represented the idea that technology could make the world smaller, more accessible, and bring people together. An aircraft that could cross an ocean in less than a day seemed almost miraculous to a generation that remembered when such journeys took weeks by ship. The Constellation, with its sleek lines and distinctive triple tail, was a glimpse of the future, a future that seemed bright and full of possibility. But the future, as it turned out, belonged to jets. In 1952, a British airliner called the de Havilland Comet entered service. It was the world's first commercial jetliner, powered by 4 turbojet engines that propelled it to speeds of 500 miles per hour and altitudes of 40,000 feet. The Comet was faster, smoother, and quieter than any propeller-driven aircraft. Passengers loved it. Airlines were intrigued. But the Comet's promise turned to tragedy. In 1954, 2 Comets disintegrated in flight due to metal fatigue around the windows, a flaw in the pressurized fuselage design that engineers had not anticipated. The entire Comet fleet was grounded. Confidence in jet travel was shaken. It seemed briefly that the era of propeller airliners might continue indefinitely. But Boeing had been watching, and Boeing was developing its own jetliner. On July 15, 1954, Boeing's prototype 367-80, the Dash 80, which would become the 707, took to the skies for the first time. It was larger, faster, and more capable than the Comet. Boeing engineers had learned from the Comet's failures and designed the 707 to avoid them. The 707 could carry more passengers, fly farther, and operate more economically than any propeller airliner. And it was undeniably the future. Pan American World Airways ordered 20 Boeing 707s in October 1955, a decision that would reshape the airline industry. Other carriers quickly followed. TWA ordered 707s. American Airlines chose the rival Douglas DC-8, a nearly identical jetliner. The jet age had arrived. For the Constellation, this meant obsolescence. The aircraft that had seemed so advanced just a decade earlier was suddenly outdated. Jets were twice as fast. They flew higher, above the weather, providing smoother rides. They required less maintenance, and crucially, they were more economical. Jets could carry more passengers per flight and complete more flights per day, generating more revenue for airlines. By the late 1950s, airlines were retiring their Constellations and replacing them with jets. TWA, which had been the Constellation's most loyal operator, phased out its fleet by 1967. Other carriers followed. Some Constellations were sold to cargo operators, where they continued flying freight for a few more years. Others were sold to smaller airlines in South America, Africa, and Asia, where they provided service on regional routes. A few were converted for specialized roles, aerial firefighting, reconnaissance, or radar platforms for the military. But most were simply scrapped. Thousands of hours of flight time, millions of miles traveled, decades of engineering excellence reduced to aluminum scrap sold by the pound. It was a sad end for an aircraft that had meant so much to so many. For those who had flown on Constellations as passengers, pilots, or crew, the transition to jets was bittersweet. Jets were faster and more efficient, certainly, but they lacked something intangible. The experience of flying on a Constellation was intimate, human scale. You could see the propellers spinning. You could hear the engines. You felt connected to the act of flight in a way that passengers in a sealed, whisper-quiet jet cabin did not. Captain Robert Mudge, who flew Constellations for TWA in the 1950s and later transitioned to Boeing 707s, captured this sentiment in an interview years later. The 707 was a fine airplane, he said. Professional, efficient, capable. But the Connie was something more. She had personality. She had soul. When you pushed the throttles forward on a Constellation and felt those 4 big radials come to life, when you lifted off and felt the airframe settle into flight, it was magic. The jets never gave you that feeling. They were just machines. The Connie was alive. Stewardesses who had worked on Constellations often felt the same way. The work was harder. No galleys with modern ovens, no prepackaged meals, no automated systems. Everything was manual, hands-on. But there was pride in that work and a sense of camaraderie among the crew. They were pioneers in an industry still finding its identity. They represented their airlines and their country to passengers from around the world, and they did it with grace and professionalism that became legendary. One former TWA stewardess, Patricia O'Connell, recalled her years flying on Constellations with obvious affection. "We worked long hours, dealt with demanding passengers, and flew through weather that would ground flights today," she said. "But I loved every minute. There was something special about the Connie. The way she looked, the way she flew, and the passengers they were excited to be flying. It wasn't routine for them. It was an experience. That made our job meaningful." As the 1960s progressed and the last Constellations disappeared from commercial service, a small group of aviation enthusiasts began efforts to preserve surviving examples. They recognized that the Constellation represented a pivotal era in aviation history, the transition from piston engines to jets, from exclusive travel to mass transportation, from the romance of flight to the efficiency of modern air travel. Losing all the Constellations would mean losing a tangible connection to that era. Several organizations acquired retired Constellations and began the painstaking work of restoration. The aircraft had often been sitting outdoors for years, exposed to weather, stripped of valuable parts, corroded and deteriorating. Restoring one to flying condition required thousands of hours of labor and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Volunteers, many of them retired airline employees or aviation enthusiasts, donated time and expertise. Parts were fabricated from scratch when originals couldn't be found. Engines were overhauled, systems rebuilt, airframes repaired. One of the most famous restored Constellations is Columbine II, President Dwight D. Eisenhower's personal aircraft during his presidency. This VC-121A, a military variant of the Constellation, is now displayed at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Visitors can board the aircraft and see the presidential compartment, the communications equipment, and the crew stations, a snapshot of 1950s technology and presidential travel. Another notable survivor is the Star of Switzerland, a superconstellation operated by the Super Constellation Flyers Association in Switzerland. This aircraft, painstakingly restored to flying condition, appears at airshows across Europe, carrying passengers on nostalgic flights and keeping the memory of the Constellation era alive. When it flies, crowds gather to watch and listen. The sound of its 4 right engines is unmistakable, a deep, powerful roar that carries across miles. For those old enough to remember, it's a sound that brings tears and smiles in equal measure. The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum preserves a constellation as well, displayed at the Udvar Hazy Center near Washington Dulles International Airport. Painted in the livery of Eastern Airlines, the aircraft hangs from the ceiling alongside other historic aircraft, a testament to the role it played in aviation history. But most constellations are gone. Of the 856 built by Lockheed between 1943 and 1958, fewer than 20 remain in any condition. Only a handful are airworthy. The rest have vanished, scrapped, crashed, abandoned in remote airfields, and left to decay. Each lost constellation represents not just an aircraft, but the end of a connection to history, to the people who built and flew them, and to an era that can never be recreated. The golden age of flight that the constellation represented, roughly 1945 to 1960, was brief. It was a transitional period between the early, primitive years of aviation and the modern jet age. It was a time when flying was still special, still an event, still something people dressed up for and looked forward to. It was an era when airlines competed not just on price and schedule, but on service, style, and experience. It was a moment when technology and elegance intersected, when machines were designed to be not just functional, but beautiful. The Constellation embodied all of this. Its design, the graceful fuselage, the triple tail, the polished aluminum skin, was as much art as engineering. Its performance fast enough to be competitive, comfortable enough to be luxurious set standards that other manufacturers had to meet. Its role in opening the world to air travel, making transatlantic and transcontinental flights routine rather than extraordinary, cannot be overstated. But perhaps the Constellation's greatest legacy is less tangible. It's the memories it created. The businessman closing a deal on a flight from Chicago to New York. The bride flying to meet her new husband stationed overseas. The immigrant seeing America from the window of a Constellation as it descended toward New York, the Statue of Liberty visible in the harbor below. The pilot who logged 10,000 hours in Connie's and could tell you the personality quirks of each individual aircraft he flew. The stewardess who served champagne over the Atlantic and watched the sunrise from 20,000 feet. These memories, thousands of them, millions of them, are the true legacy of the Lockheed Constellation. They represent a time when the journey mattered as much as the destination, when flying was an adventure rather than a chore, and when an aircraft could be loved not just for what it did, but for what it represented. In today's world of budget airlines, security lines, and packed cabins, it's hard to imagine the experience of flying on a Constellation. Air travel has become democratized, accessible to almost everyone, a triumph of efficiency and economics. But something has been lost: the sense of occasion, the elegance, the romance. When a restored Constellation takes flight today, when its 4 engines roar to life and it lifts gracefully into the sky, its distinctive profile unmistakable, it offers a brief window into that lost world. For a few minutes, as it circles an airfield or performs a flyby at an airshow, the present fades and the past becomes vivid. You can imagine what it was like to board one in 1952, to settle into a plush seat, to accept a cocktail from a smiling stewardess, and to gaze out the window as America unfolded below. You can imagine the excitement, the novelty, the sense that you were participating in something modern and important. The engineers who designed the Constellation are gone. Kelly Johnson passed away in 1990, having spent his career at Lockheed and designed some of the most iconic aircraft in history, including the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird. Howard Hughes died in 1976, a recluse whose brilliance had been overtaken by paranoia and illness. The pilots who flew Connies in their prime are nearly all gone now, their logbooks and memories fading into history. The stewardesses who served aboard them have aged, and each year, fewer remain to share their stories. But the aircraft itself, or rather, the few that survive, endure. They stand in museums, preserved and honored. They fly at air shows, thrilling crowds with the sights and sounds of a bygone era. They appear in documentaries and books, reminding new generations of what came before. They are more than just metal and rivets, engines and wings. They are monuments to human ingenuity, to the dream of flight, and to an age when that dream was still new enough to inspire wonder. The Lockheed Constellation didn't just transport people from one place to another. It transported them from one era to another. It carried them from the post-war years of optimism and rebuilding into the modern age of global connectivity and mass travel. It showed them that the world was smaller than they had imagined, more accessible, more connected. It proved that elegance and efficiency could coexist, that technology could serve not just function, but beauty. For those who saw her take flight, whether from the ground, watching her climb into the sky with that distinctive profile silhouetted against the clouds, or from inside, feeling the subtle vibrations of the engines and watching the earth fall away below. It wasn't just another airplane. It was a glimpse of the future, a promise that the world was opening up, that distances were shrinking, that the barriers that had separated people and places were falling away. That promise has been fulfilled. Today, hundreds of millions of people fly every year, crossing oceans and continents in hours rather than days or weeks. Air travel has become mundane, routine, even tedious. We've gained so much accessibility, affordability, efficiency, but we've lost something too. We've lost the wonder. We've lost the elegance. We've lost the sense that flying is anything more than a means to an end. The Lockheed Constellation stands as a reminder of what we've lost and what we once had. It reminds us that technology, at its best, can be beautiful. That efficiency need not preclude elegance. That progress and grace can exist together. And it reminds us that every age, no matter how modern it seems at the time, will one day be the past. The Constellation's era, the golden age of flight, seemed permanent to those living through it. But it lasted barely 15 years. The jets came, the world moved on, and the Constellation became history. But what history? What a beautiful, elegant, remarkable history. The sound of four Wright R3350 engines fades now, heard only occasionally at air shows and museum events. The sight of a Constellation in flight is rare, treasured by those lucky enough to witness it. The people who built, flew, and loved these aircraft are disappearing, taking their memories with them. But the legacy remains, in the design principles that influenced every airliner that followed, in the memories of those who experienced the golden age of flight, in the few surviving aircraft, lovingly preserved and maintained, and in the knowledge that once, for a brief and shining moment, an aircraft existed that was more than just a machine. It was a dream made real. It was elegance given form. It was the future, bright and promising, stretching out before a generation eager to embrace it. The Lockheed Constellation, the Connie, wasn't just the airliner that defined the golden age of flight. It was the golden age itself, captured in aluminum and shaped by wings, carrying humanity forward into a world that was smaller, more connected, and more filled with possibility than ever before. And for those who remember, that will never be forgotten.